or where the ruler feeds himself by plowing side by side with the people and rules while cooking his own meals. Now Tang, on the contrary, possesses granaries and treasuries, so the ruler is supporting himself by oppressing the people. China has long been associated with cyclical dynasties, and those who don't know her history often think that Chinese philosophies are either a form of mysticism and scholasticism, or doctrines that insist on outdated monarchical governments. Because of the Eurocentric worldview that we live in, the same attitude also applies to the ideas of communism, in which most people associate it with Karl Marx, and believe that communist arguments originated as one of the Western ideologies. Feminism and the ideas of women's right to work and representation in government are also something that most people would not associate with ancient China. However, those who are familiar with the history of non-Western countries and are cognizant of the history of ideas know that this is not the case. In the previous lectures, we have covered all the major schools of thought that have shaped Asia in many significant ways. So for today's lecture and the next one, we will be covering more minor schools of thought, which even most Chinese do not know. Today's topic of discourse will be on a movement in ancient China known as agriculturalism, or in Chinese, NONGJIA, by analyzing their arguments on what an ideal society is and justifications for why the economy should ultimately be run by the state. We will also be taking a look at the social dynamic between the government officials and citizens, and between sexes that the agriculturalists endorse through investigations of the remaining fragments. However, to understand this school of philosophy and its philosophers' motives and arguments, as well as appreciate its contribution to the diverse set of thoughts that helped shape Asia, first we will need to apprehend the historical context of China. From 475 BCE to 221 BCE, known as the Warring States period, China went through centuries of political turmoil by competing states after the collapse of the Zhou dynasty that brought an end to the peaceful spring and autumn period. During this era, wars were constantly waged in vicious but vain attempts to dominate other political states. Because of its constant warfare, famine and death were common. Oppression under tyrannical states was at its highest, and people were constantly murdered by the whims of despotic tyrants. Since success in the war was the only focus of the court, people's lives were of little to no importance, so most people died at an extremely young age. However, the attempts to bring about victory and glory of the states also brought about the golden age for Chinese philosophy, where 100 schools of thoughts flourished. The thoughts and ideas discussed and refined during this age have profoundly influenced Asia up to this day. Among the 100 schools, the 10 schools of thought were the primary schools that were listed in the Book of Han. They were Confucianism, Taoism, Legalism, Mohism, Agriculturalism, School of Diplomacy, School of Logicians, School of Minor Talks, School of Miscellany, and the School of Naturalists, also known as the School of Yin-Yang. However, when the Warring States period ended with the unification of China, a newly victorious leader of the Qin state ordered all books on philosophy to be burned to restrict people's thoughts and indoctrinate people into following the state-sanctioned ideology. Books on medicine, war, and agriculture, however, were spared. Moreover, what is left in the official records had been corrupted tremendously by the emperor. This dissipated its distinctiveness and made it seem as though the political philosophy of the agriculturalists was suited only to ancient times, while the state-sanctioned ideologies were not, so it could not mislead any administrators. This was accomplished by paraphrasing the original sentences and taking the agriculturalist words out of context to suit their needs. Therefore, among the philosophical schools of ancient China that are still on the record, we know the least about the school of agriculturalism. So, unfortunately, instead of a series of lectures, we will only be able to make a single video exploring this school of philosophy. Fortunately, there are still fragments from books such as Huainenzi, Lü Xue Chunqiu, Han Feizi, and others that have undergone minimal distortion in content and ideas, which we can use to learn about the agriculturalists. Like philosophers of other schools of philosophy that took inspirations from the past periods and ancient rulers, the agriculturalists also looked up to Shen Nong in his society. Therefore, when they debated with philosophers from other schools to solve the predicament that they were in, they used Shen Nong as the ideal ruler for society and presented his society as a possible solution that could end the Warring States period. According to historical books, the school of agriculturalism was identified as a school that reflected the aspirations of farmers, craftsmen, and peasants and formed its foundational thoughts based on Shen Nong and his society. Although the founding date of the school is uncertain, scholars tend to agree that there was a philosopher named Xu Xing from 372 BCE to 289 BCE who, along with his comrades, settled in the state of Tang in 315 BCE and defended the ideals of the agriculturalists. However, no one knows whether he was the one who started this proto-anarcho-communist movement. The members of the school believed that there was no purpose in establishing governments, owning private property, and instituting wage labor. They also believed that social classes naturally led to oppression, so came to the conclusion that everyone, from peasants to the king, must work the land equally and benefit the community. Thus, their ideal state is a decentralized domain consisting of small communities in which the government plays no role in governing, except to ensure that the economy is running properly. They claim that the ideal government is one which reigns in perfect peace over the people, without issuing decrees, establishing law, or imposing punishments. This mode of thinking contrasted the Confucians and the Mohists, who viewed the state of nature, a time before the institution of the government, as a time of anarchy, consisting only of wars of all against all. However, Shengzi, a legalist philosopher, even admitted that there was indeed a time of perfect order without an organized government. In the book of Shengzi, chapter 18, he describes the agriculturalist utopian aspiration as, "In the age of Shen Nong, they were fed by the plowing of the man, clothed by the weaving of the woman. He ruled without the use of punishments or administration. He reigned without resorting to weapons and armor." The role that the agriculturalist government plays is especially highlighted from a fragment in the book of Huainanzi as, "Formerly, when Shen Nong ruled the empire, the Mao rain fell when it was due. The 5 grains flourished. In spring, they sprouted, in summer grew up, in autumn were harvested, in winter stored. There were monthly inspections. There were seasonal trials. At the year's end, they reported how much had been done. In due season, the grains were tasted and offered as a sacrifice in the hall of Li." Even though there were neither administration, in Chinese as Chang, nor laws as Fa, Shen Nong did not rule by wordless influence, such as his virtue, Te, like a Taoist sage. What described as his teachings appeared to be a broad sense of models or standards, and his orders consisted of specific injunctions that his citizens voluntarily obeyed. They did so because they believed in their community leader and saw his teachings as useful ways to foster agriculture and their lives. The ruler that the agriculturalists were arguing for is described in chapter 31 of Huainanzi as, "What grows up through the spring and autumn is not to be injured or obstructed. Carefully tend what is beneficial in the land, so that the myriad things complete their growth. Do not snatch away what benefits the people, and the farmers will work in accord with the seasons." The agriculturalists also advanced the argument for a meritocratic system that the government should rely upon to run the economy. They claimed that a ruler and his administration should also aspire to be like Shen Nong, who gave responsibilities to the worthy and employed the capable, so that the officials will be talented, and the knowledgeable people would flock over to volunteer for service. The agriculturalists also argued for self-sufficient communities, in Chinese as Guo, in which rampant consumerism should not take hold of people's hearts. They believe that if the communities are self-sufficient and people are content with what they already have in their community, then no one would be interested in consuming fancy goods that are produced in other communities. The opening of chapter 129 on economics in the Shi described their living style in the communist utopia as, "In the utmost perfection of government, neighboring fiefs see each other in the distance. The sound of cocks and dogs in one is heard in the other, but in each of them, the people find their food sweet enough, their clothes beautiful enough. They are content with their customs, delight in their work, and grow old and die without ever coming or going." Furthermore, the lords of each community, like Shen Nong, presumably also worked on their fields. According to the ideals of the agriculturalists, the officials who were busy picking their crops would not have time to raise taxes, to benefit themselves, or to seek glory by going to war, building lavish palaces, and establishing the laws to inflict punishments. In the book of Yue Chui, chapter 16, The description of Shen Nong is that of a man whose only concern was to benefit the communities, so he did not seek any compensation for his work. He did not place himself above others despite his capabilities and spent what he earned from laboring in the fields. Therefore, when people in the communities saw the performance of Shen Nong, they enrich and honor him. When Xu Xing settled in the new state and set up his community, he aimed to build an alternative society where the whole community would strive for the satisfaction of the members of the community. He presumably hoped to set an example so that the proletariats from other states will also take notice and follow their example by overthrowing the existing institutions until the nations will once again become little communities, like in the time of Shen Nong. From these state of facts, we can also infer that they might have also practiced a form of democratic government system in which, no matter who is in charge of running the community, as long as the lords carry their duties accordingly like Shen Nong, and they have the ability to do so, they will likely receive the support from the people in the community. However, knowing how the agriculturalists criticized the contemporary institutions of their age and wished to transform their society through revolutions, we can also infer that if the lords did not receive adequate support from the people, then they may also be ousted from their duties and will be replaced. The agriculturalists also argued for a controlled economy and fixed market prices, which they believe would save the peasant workers, or in terms of Karl Marx, the proletariats, from being exploited by traders and landowners, whom we will be referring to as the bourgeoisies. Their advocacy for the policy of maintaining regular supplies and constant prices is described in an obscure fragment as, "If one grain fails, reduce the one grain, and let the issue of the grains be tenfold. If 2 grains fail, reduce the 2 grains, and again let the issue of the grains be tenfold. Maintain a full supply, give the old grain to those without food, lend new seed to those without seed. Hence, there will be no tenfold prices and no profiteering people." In other words, the agriculturalists desired to put an end to the fluctuation of price with a state-controlled supply and demand to prevent the exploitation of the workers by the bourgeoisies. By getting rid of the private property in favor of common ownership of the means of production, as the phrase "maintain a full supply" suggests, they believe this exploitation of labor can be prevented. Also, by controlling the varying supply of grain, this will stop rampant uncontrolled profit for the bourgeoisie at the expense of the needs of the people in the community. When the profit only goes toward a small group of people who control the prices, the majority will suffer and be forced into laboring from dawn to twilight, only receiving basic necessities. That being the case, the agriculturalists promoted a policy of public storage of goods in the good years and redistribution of the goods in the bad, which will level out the playing field of different prices. We can assume that in the agriculturalist society, there will be no bourgeoisies, but only the proletariats, and the ruler would simply maintain the economy. As a result, everyone in the community would be able to go to their local markets with confidence that they will always pay the same price for the same length of cloth. Because of the state-sanctioned economy and the redistribution of wealth and resources, we might be suspicious of their proposal and reject it, because we believe that if we do not need to work hard to fight for ourselves because we are receiving free supplies, then there will be no motivation to work at all. In the book of Huainanzi, chapter 11, this would not be the case, as the period of Shen Nong rule was described as. In guiding the people, Shen Nong did not value commodities difficult to obtain, did not treasure things without use. Consequently, any who did not work hard at plowing had no means to support life. Any who did not work hard at weaving had nothing with which to clothe the body. Whether one had ample or less than enough was each person's responsibility. Food and clothing were abundant. Crimes and vices did not breed. They lived untroubled in security and happiness, and the world ran on an even level, so there was no scope for Confucius and Zhengzi to exercise their goods, or for Mengpan and Changqing to make people fear them. In other words, everyone must support themselves by their labor as long as they can do so. If each person knows that he must work for his living, then there will be no need for moral teachers to guide us to live virtuous lives, since everyone will be too busy to go to war or commit a crime. And as long as production and consumption is based on the guiding principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, as Marx puts it, then there will neither be starvation nor cold, and happiness and satisfaction will be attainable. Consequently, working hard for our living will result in peace and universal abundance, as well as the abolishment of tyrannical governments, like the ones that they had during the Warring States period. This likely result was commented by Han Feizi, the legalist philosopher, in chapter 46 of the book of Han Feizi as one who will work hard when he has enough goods and utensils is a Shen-nong, one who disciplines his behavior when the ruler's government is mild, it's a Zeng or Shi. The agriculturalists were also in favor of making their communities more egalitarian compared to their contemporary society counterparts. Their view on the equality between men and women is observed from the way that they visualize their ideal society, where both men and women contribute to the good of the community. Their egalitarian endorsement was illuminated in chapter 11 from the book of Huainanzi as, if in the prime of life a man does not plow, someone in the world will go hungry because of it. If in the prime of life a woman does not weave, someone in the world will be cold because of it. Therefore, he himself plowed with his own hands, and his wife herself wove to give a lead to the world. From this fragment, we can see that the society that the agriculturalists envisioned is not where it is run by men alone. Woman will also play a pivotal role to feed her family, and she will be contributing to their community just as much as the men in her community. The power that women hold is not just present in their respective households, they can also be observed in government positions. Their egalitarian and feminist sentiments are further elaborated from that fragment in Xuezi, where even Shen-nong and his officials and their respective family members, including their wives, would collaborate likely as equals in order to run the economy of the communities. Fragments suggest the rulers of the house of Shen-nong carry loads on their backs, and their wives carry loads on their heads. In order to govern the empire, he, of the house of Yu, had his own grain field. His wife had a mulberry field. The house of Shen-nong reigned plowing side by side with the people. It was to urge cultivation. Agriculturalists think of small communities where a person's words can be trusted by his neighbors or strangers without the need of oath or covenants. The community would be where only a couple of people create problems or have disputes with one another, but instead of calling on the law, they are settled by local customs. Despite the trend of the times toward larger and larger political states, they refuse to reconcile with the attitude that the bigger the state, the better it is, and steadfastly maintain that the empire can rather be a federation of small communities. We will end today's lecture with a sorrowful story from a fragment in the book of Han Feizi about one of the brothers who was executed by the Duke of Zhou for setting up a bad example. When Taikong Wang was in fact in the east, in the state of Qi, by the sea on the east of Qi, there were two brothers who were hermits called Kuang Yi and Hua Shi. They upheld a doctrine: we shall not be subjects of the emperor. We shall not make friends with the feudal lords. We shall eat what we get by plowing, drink from a well that we dig ourselves. We shall not seek anything from other men. We shall not have the titles of superiors, shall not have a stipend from the ruler. We shall work, not as officials, but as laborers.